Okay, let's get started. This is LaRouche Pack Saturday Night Class series. This is the second in a three-part series on Dante by Robert Ingram. Tonight's is entitled Dante's Divine Commedia. So, Bob, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, folks. So, yes, this is the second part in the series on Dante. We are primarily going to be discussing the commedia, or in English, the comedy, or as Boccaccio called it, Dante's Divine Comedy, as it's generally known by Americans today. I'm not going to go into a long prologue about the relevance of all of this. I discussed this some last week, and hopefully what is presented tonight will be relevant for people. Now, I'll just begin by saying that any attempt to have a serious presentation or discussion about the entirety of the Divine Comedy in, say, a 45-minute presentation is pretty ridiculous. It's pretty absurd. There are certain key features of this, which I'm going to go into, but I will state right off the bat that there is no substitute to reading it in its entirety, to read it for oneself. You cannot walk away from this class and say, well, now I know the Divine Comedy. It doesn't work that way. I will say just a short comment on the question of translations. When we get to the Paradise in this class tonight, when we get to the Paradise, I'm going to be reading some excerpts from the Paradise. And the translation that I'm using is the one by Robert and Jean Hollander out of Princeton University. I'm not saying it's the best translation. I'm just saying it's the one that I personally like the most. The fact is, I'll read you a quote from Dante, and it sort of sums it up. Dante wrote this. This was not in the comedy. He wrote this somewhere else, but he said, "Nothing that is harmonized by the laws of poetry can be changed from its own language to another without destroying all its sweetness and harmony." So that's Dante, and he's basically saying you can't translate poetry, and really that's true. All you can hope to do is to do as little damage to it as possible, while conveying the meaning to the best of your understanding of the poet. Obviously, the best thing is to read Dante in Italian, but probably very few people on the call tonight can do it. So my suggestion is to find one you like. I mean, there have been a lot of translations, over 50, many more than 50 translations of Dante into English. They're wildly different. So find one that you find readable, and read it. And I urge everyone who is on the call tonight to read it. So that said, before we get into the commedia, I want to just say a little bit, not very much, but a little bit about Dante and poetry, because the Divine Comedy is a poem. But Dante began writing poetry when he was very young. I mean, no one knows really when he started. He was certainly writing poetry as a teenager. None of that poetry really has survived, his earliest poetry. But then in 1283, when he was 17 years old, he published his first poem. This was something called, and again, I'm going to be using a number of Italian words in this presentation, and if I massacre them, you'll have to forgive me. But his first published poem when he was 17 was titled Ciascun alma presa, which translated is to every captive soul and gentle heart. Now, with the publication of that poem, Dante continued, following that publication, he continued to write poetry. And he became associated with a group of poets in Florence and in greater Florence, in the province of Tuscany, but particularly in Florence, who were associated with a group called the Dolce Stile Nuovo, the sweet new style of poetry. And this was lyric poetry, a lot of sonnets, things like this. And it wasn't invented in Florence. It really, this new style of poetry grew out of two earlier phenomena. One was the poetry of, what are generally called the troubadours, although that's a bad term, the poetry of southern France and northern Spain, and then the poetry out of the Sicilian school, out of Sicily. And Dante in particular, in his book on the eloquence in the vernacular, pays great homage to the Sicilian school. And one of the things, there were two of the things which distinguished both the French and Sicilian schools, and they were different, but there were two of the things that distinguished them. One was that all of the poetry was written in the vernacular, that is, in the native language of the region, and which was not really common or not done at all up to that period. And secondly, most of this poetry, particularly out of the French school, but also out of the Sicilian school, was written to be sung, and usually, if they were available, accompanied by instruments. So these were really musical pieces, not all of them, but that's what this poetry came out of. Very musical, very lyric, and this school in Florence sort of developed out of this. Now, from 1283 to 1293, for 10 years, Dante continued to write poetry. And then in 1294, he published what he called his small book. That's the term he gave it, which comes down to us today as La Vita Nuova, the new life, which is readily available in English translation. It is a small book. It's thin. It contains about 30 poems, out of those poems, about 25 of them are sonnets written in iambic pentameter, Shakespeare's meter. And there's a few other poems. But there are two things to say about this. The first is that what Dante did in the publication of La Vita Nuova was revolutionary in the following sense. Up to that time, all serious literature, was written in Latin. Didn't matter where you lived, Sicily, Italy, France, the Holy Roman Empire, all serious literature was written in Latin. Now, it's true that this vernacular poetry was developed in southern France and Sicily, but this was considered sort of low class, entertainment. A lot of the early poems in southern France, in what's called the Languedoc region, weren't even written down. They don't survive to this day because they were written basically as the lyrics to musical themes, and they were performed for the aristocracy. And a lot of them were bawdy, and there was chivalrous love and all of this stuff. And it was considered not really legitimate literature. So you had this vernacular poetry. But what Dante does in La Vita Nuova is that if you read it, there are about 30 poems, but the poems take up a relatively small percentage of the total book. He has a sonnet, and then he writes a long, I don't know if you call it an essay, but there's a long discussion of the sonnet, a long discussion of the themes of the sonnet and what's going on and what people should look for and what the significance of it is. And this accompanies every poem in the book. And not only are the poems in La Vita Nuova in the vernacular, but all of the prose, which is most of the book, is in the vernacular. Now, this was revolutionary. This was unheard of. It was scandalous that Dante had done this. And this began his campaign, his lifelong effort to develop the Italian language, to popularize the Italian language. He was in one sense making a statement, or you could even, go so far if you wanted to, as to say he was declaring war, and that what he was writing, and everything he wrote in his life, except for one item, was in the vernacular. And what he was writing was not for the nobility, the priesthood, the people who had studied Latin, from private tutors or in monasteries. He was writing for the Italian people, for the people. And he was developing the language. He was creating a language as he went along. And this begins with La Vita Nuova. Now, the other thing that's noticeable about La Vita Nuova, and this is very short shrift, but it's all I'm going to say about it, is that there is a big change from the earlier lyric poetry of France and Sicily. Because if you look at this earlier poetry, a lot of it, most of it is written around themes and characters of chivalry, chivalric love, sensuous love. Some of it is bawdy, some of it isn't. But it is, it's all tied to sort of these earthly, sensual themes. And if you read the sonnets and Dante's discussion of the sonnets in La Vita Nuova, he is doing something else entirely. The book is about the subject of love, but he is elevating this to a much higher discussion. I mean, as some people might know, the story in La Vita Nuova is that Dante met this young girl and fell in love with this young girl named Beatrice, when he was 9 years old. And then the story of the poems, as they progress, go over a period of 16 years of his relationship with Beatrice. But what he develops is the idea is that love is based on human reason, not on sensual appetites. And he develops this in many different ways in the poems. So this is a real break with the poetry of the past. And his use of the vernacular was completely shocking to the people around him at that time. So that's all I'm going to say about La Vida Nuova. I can't spend any more time on it, given what it is we're going to have to go through. Now, before we actually get into the beginning of the comedy, there are two preliminary things I want to say about it. One is that I want to read to you some comments. Well, actually, it's from an article from Lyndon LaRouche, which he wrote in 1984, so a long time ago. In 1984, LaRouche authored a fairly lengthy work titled The Science of the Human Mind. And within that long work, he also has a fairly lengthy subsection entitled Dante's Commedia. And I'm going to read you about a one-page excerpt from that article. It's a little long, but I don't see any way around it to set the stage for how we're going to discuss this. And LaRouche says the following: "It is well established that the three levels of development possible for the human individual fall among three general categories, as those three categories are described by the three successive canticles of Dante Alighieri's Commedia: Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise. The first is infantile man, the irrationalistic hedonist, whose philosophical world outlook is that of David Hume, Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, and John Stuart Mill, among others. The second is of the philosophical world outlook best typified by Immanuel Kant, the Kant of his Critique of Practical Reason. To identify the third, a preliminary discussion is required. The fact of our individual mortality ought to impress each of us at some point in our pre-adolescent or adolescent development that those hedonistic pleasures whose memory exists chiefly in the experience of our own flesh die in our grave with us. To live a life serving the pursuit of such individual pleasure is to die as a beast dies, leaving nothing after us better in principle than what is bequeathed to us by the beasts who died yesterday in the slaughterhouse. The beginning of wisdom is to reflect upon this lesson, that we not waste our brief lives living and dying like mere beasts. To accomplish this, we must find a means to make our having once lived of durable advantage to both our contemporaries and our society's posterity in general. We must make some contribution to the advancement of the human condition. We must develop our potentialities accordingly. This broad preliminary answer poses a second question, a deeper question. How can we have foreknowledge of what will be of such advantage to mankind? The case of the individual in purgatory helps to instruct us that to realize the higher self-interest in the good, it is not sufficient to be able to recognize the good descriptively, or even to be inspired by the desire to achieve what he describes as good. We must become good. The good must become our immediate self-interest. our immediate motivation in every aspect of personal life. To achieve that congruence of personal, self-interested impulses and a service of the good is the condition of paradise. Reason itself cannot define sanity. Without the motive to submit one's will to reason, the individual's will be submitted more or less fully to the bestial ordering of impulses of wretches of the inferno, or perhaps of purgatory. Without a love for reason, more powerful than the infantile hedonism to which one is born, reason will not be attained. In that sense, reason and the love of reason and corresponding hostility toward existentialist irrationalism are the essential characteristics of the sane adult mind. This ennobled state of the majority of citizens is characterized relative to purgatory by a shift of the sense of personal identity and personal self-interest within society to the individual's true self-interest as a world historical personality, a personality whose immediate motive of self-interest is the development and exercise of the powers to contribute a durable good to his or her society over succeeding generations to come. It is that shift of the cathexis of sense of personal identity and self-interest within the personality which defines paradise. So that's the end of the quote from LaRouche. Now, that's long. That was long, I know. But I couldn't see any way to sum that up in my own words. And hopefully people were able to follow what I had to say and to keep in mind what I just read you as we move into the comedy. However, before we do that, there is one other preliminary topic which I want to bring up. I mentioned the whole question of the vernacular, which I'm going to talk a lot more about next week in the concluding class. But I do think it's necessary to bring it up now because the language of the Commedia is absolutely extraordinary. Dante had used different poetic forms in earlier writings. He had written a lot of sonnets, some in iambic pentameter. He also had written what are called canzoni, which are like poetic songs in a number of his works. But in the Commedia, he literally invented, an entirely new poetic form, which is called terza rima. And it has a rhyme scheme, which he also invented. It's kind of hard to explain this in a video like this, but the rhyme scheme is ABA, BCB, CDC, DED, EFE, then it goes on from there, where the first and it's written in tercets, the Commedia. A tercet is a three-line rhyme, three-line sort of grouping of lines. It's written in tercets where the ending of the first and third line rhyme. The second line does not rhyme. But then the ending of the second line rhymes with the first line of the next tercet. And the first line of the next tercet rhymes with the third line of that tercet. And then there's another new ending in the second tercet, in the second line, which becomes the ending of the first line of the third tercet. So what this does is, there's no meter in the divine comedy. There's no iambic pentameter or any other kind of meter. It's unmetered. It's but what this terza rima does, it is a rhyme scheme which is constantly, there's incredible motion. You're not reading something static. You're not reading like sing-song poetry. It's the way it is written is that the first tercet drives you to the second tercet, which drives you to the third tercet. There is constant motion, constant forward motion in what he's writing, because there's no meter, there's a great deal of freedom within the tercets, and Dante uses this really to speed up the motion, slow down the motion, change the mood. It is really a remarkable piece of writing. So at this, what I'd like to do is put up that first picture just to give you an idea of this. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this, folks. This is the beginning of the Inferno. This is how the comedy starts.
Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. Ai quanto a dir qual era e cosa dura esta selva selvaggia e aspra e forte che nel pensier rinnova la paura. Tante amara che poco è più morte, ma per trattar del ben ch'io vi trovai, dirò dell'altre cose chi vo scorte. Io non so ben ridir com'io ventrai, tant'era pien di sonno a quel punto che la verace via abbandonai. Ma poi ch'io fui al piede un colle giunto, là dove terminava quella valle che m'avea di paura il cor compunto, guardai in alto e vidi le sue spalle vestite già dei raggi del pianeta che mena dritto al truppo.
All right. That's all we're going to listen to of it. Let me get my microphone be set up here. Okay. All right, you can take that down, Susan. So I hope you got some sense of that, and you actually, if you pay close attention, you can hear the terza rima rhyme, and you can hear the dynamic motion in the language. And this is why it's very, very, very difficult to translate something like this into another language. But I want to say a little bit more about the language and the writing of the Commedia, because, I mean, this is a work that is extraordinarily rich in language and extraordinarily rich in metaphor and imagery. The Inferno, I mean, one of the main things, one of the main metaphors throughout the entirety of all three books is light. And as Dante enters the Inferno and descends downward, because in the Inferno, he and his companion Virgil are climbing down deeper and deeper. And as they descend, it gets darker and darker and darker till when they get to the bottom, it's just inky blackness practically. Now, this is not because of visible light. This is because as they climb downward, they're getting further and further away from the presence of God. And as they get further and further away, things get blacker and blacker. And when you get to the bottom, which is where Lucifer is, it's cold, icy, black, you know, well, then what happens as they go into the purgatory, and in the purgatory, they're climbing a mountain, a physical mountain. And as they climb up the mountain, it begins to get lighter and clearer. And this is because they are ascending toward God. Now, it's not just the light itself, and Dante uses all kinds of words to express this light. I'll just give you, and he's basically examining various shadings, various meanings of what he is, what he's experiencing and what he's presenting. He uses the word luce, light, raggio, radiance, splendore, splendor, and many other words of this type, which shift as he moves from, ascends the mountain of purgatory. And it's not physical light. It's the light radiating down from paradise, and it's not just a question of his sight. It's also a question of his mind and his emotions. In the Inferno, Dante is very confused, very conflicted, often overcome, as he witnesses the horrible punishments being imposed on people in the Inferno. He weeps, he cries, he faints, he falls down, he's physically weak. But then as he begins to ascend in the purgatory, into the area of light, his mind clears, his intellect clears, his vision clears. So he's not just ascending from darkness to light, but from one level of existence, one level of comprehension, one level really of morality, to a higher one as he ascends upwards. So with that said, given the time here, I'll just begin. Now, I can't give you a travelogue of the Divine Comedy. I'm just going to touch upon certain things which I think are important. So, as most people know, who have looked at this at all, the work begins, the Inferno begins, where Dante is at a moment of great personal crisis. He says in the Inferno, at the beginning of it, the straight way was lost. He finds himself in a woods. He doesn't know how he got there. He's confused. He's distressed. And he says his mind is pierced with fear. Now, at that moment, Virgil, the Roman poet, appears. He had been sent by Beatrice to lead Dante on a journey. So they set off together, and Virgil leads Dante through the entranceway into the Inferno, which has the famous, sign, or whatever you want to call it, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." As they enter into the opening scenes of the Inferno, the first thing that Dante experiences, his senses are assaulted by anguished screams coming from within. Now, at that point, over the course of the Inferno, they climb downwards. through what are the 9 circles of hell. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is the realm, these 9 circles of hell, of of bestial appetites, if you want to put it in a certain kind of way, you could say it's a realm governed by the oligarchical principle. Dante doesn't use that term, but I think it's apt. Of people who lived and acted as beasts, governed by the hedonistic motivations that Lyndon LaRouche talked about in the thing that I read to you from him. It's the home for those who have completely closed themselves off from their true human nature. They've closed their hearts off from agape, from their their human potential, and as they progress, they descend downward. They pass through the rings of lust, gluttony, greed, wrath. These are all in what is called upper hell. Then in Canto 9, they enter what is called the city of Dis, which contains lower hell, which is inhabited by the heretics and the violent. And as they descend downward, the punishments get worse and worse and worse, more brutal, more gruesome. In Canto 18, they enter what is called manipulable, which is given over to those guilty of fraud. And this itself is subdivided into 10 rings. And I will just mention here that Dante places 3 popes in manipulable, and he places 5 popes by name in the Inferno. And there are many gruesome punishments. Corrupt politicians are immersed in a lake of boiling pitch, guarded by demons who tear them to pieces with claws. The falsifiers are afflicted with different types of horrible diseases and lie screaming in stench, thirst, filth, and darkness. Some run through the pit, tearing each other to pieces. The sowers of discord are hacked and mutilated for all eternity by a large demon wielding a bloody sword. And here, why don't we put up the next 4 pictures in succession, Susan? I'm only doing this to give you a sense of it. These are from the illustrations by Dore, and I'm only doing this to give you a sense. These are those who are in a pit of fire. You go to the next one. I don't even know what this is, but you can see it certainly doesn't look good. Go to the next one. Again, there's Dante and Virgil. Go to the next one. I'm not going to try to describe all these, but all right, you can take that down. The only reason I do that, I don't want people to think about pictures, and we're not going to use any pictures when we get to paradise, is just, this is a truly horrifying and terrifying journey that they are taking as they descend downward. And it's the language is unbelievably moving and emotional, as Dante can barely stand what it is that he's witnessing. And then finally they descend to the 9th circle, which is the icy lake of Cocytus, where the treacherous are punished for all eternity. And at the very center of this frozen lake is Lucifer, who has committed the ultimate sin of treachery against God. Now, Lucifer, unlike what you get in popular literature, Lucifer is not the ruler of hell. It's not like better to reign in hell than serve in heaven or something. He does not reign in hell. He's the ultimate victim, the furthest away from God, being punished for the ultimate sin, in misery for all eternity. And that is really how the Inferno ends. So what I want to do now is I'm going to have to just keep moving. Okay, folks? They go through the center of the earth, Dante and Virgil. They climb out on the other side at the bottom of what's called Mount Purgatory. And on Easter Sunday, they begin their ascent of Mount Purgatory. And Dante introduces this by saying, "Now I shall sing the second kingdom, there where the soul of man is cleansed, made worthy to ascend to heaven." One thing I want to say is, when they entered hell, all these condemned souls are being dragged into hell on these boats across a river. I forget the name of it. It's a pandemonium, screaming, agony. But the souls entering purgatory are let in by an angel. And you could put up the next slide. In fact, I think, though it's not I think I skipped one, but forget that. Just go on. Yeah. You see, there's Dante and Virgil on the left. The people on the right are those who are entering purgatory, and they're being led by an angel. And the angels appear over and over again in purgatory because they're leading those in purgatory to paradise. Those who are entering purgatory, if they do what is necessary, will achieve paradise. Purgatory is the arena. You could take it down. Purgatory is the arena of what you could call atonement or redemption. Essentially, it's the arena where people who are in purgatory, the souls who are in purgatory, are still drawn in two directions, right? Between their desire for the good, and the fact that their identities, their appetites are still rooted in bestiality. Where the union of the will, where the union of the will, the individual will with the good, is imperfect. It has not yet been perfected. So the purgatory is a place of struggle. Everyone who is in the purgatory can ascend to paradise. But this is an entirely willful process. You don't get it by saying, just saying prayers, saying a rosary or something. You don't get it by saying, I want to go there. It's a willful process of self-perfection. And this is what the people in the purgatory are going through. Now, in the purgatory, there are people there who are guilty of some of the same sins as those who are punished in the Inferno. avarice, gluttony, lust, but there's a difference in that some of what they are guilty of, it's what Dante calls imperfect love, sins of imperfect love, where their motivations were not all bad. They didn't know better. There were redeeming qualities about them. So it's to some degrees, it was a matter of intention, that their intention was not bad. But nevertheless, they are not purified of these sins. And there are, as they ascend Mount Purgatory, all of the people in purgatory are still being punished. It's not all, just fun and games. Let's sit around and purify ourselves. But they're being punished. Generally, the punishments are not as gruesome as those in the Inferno, but you have people. There was one group with their eyes sewn shut with iron wire, another group walking around in acrid smoke. The gluttonous are starved in the presence of trees whose fruit is out of reach. So the punishments are very real, but there is the hope of redemption, of moving upward. And as I said, as Dante and Virgil move up Mount Purgatory, they're moving up closer and closer to the presence of God, and the light begins to brighten. The clouds disappear. Dante's mind is thinking more clearly. And this is the process of, atonement that is the process that goes on in purgatory. Finally, they reach the earthly paradise, which is in a very dramatic scene. Dante is reunited with Beatrice, but this is no longer the same Beatrice as in La Vita Nuova. This is no longer, the adolescent love that Dante had, which was noble, but was still adolescent and was still connected to an individual human being. The Beatrice of the paradise is a Beatrice who has found the unity of her will, with the good, this will become apparent as I read some quotes from the paradise. Virgil leaves because he's not allowed at that point to enter paradise, and Beatrice becomes Dante's guide through paradise. He is he's drawn through two rivers, the river Lethe, which erases the memory of past sin, and the river Uno, which he drinks from, restoring his good memories and preparing him for the ascent to heaven. And you could show that one. Yeah, that's Dante there, and see his head being drawn through the river, which leads him, which prepares him to enter paradise. Beatrice leads Dante through the ring of fire, which separates purgatory from paradise, and he enters paradise, which is depicted as a series of concentric spheres surrounding the earth, consisting of the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars, the primum mobile, and finally the Empyrean. And this is what Dante says as he enters paradise. The glory of him who moves all things pervades the universe and shines in one part more and in another less. I was in that heaven which receives more of his light. He who comes down from there can neither know nor tell what he has seen, for drawing near to its desire, so deeply is our intellect immersed that memory cannot follow after it. Nevertheless, as much of the holy kingdom as I could store as a treasure in my mind shall now become the subject of my song. So he's preparing you for what he's about to describe. Now, one of the things that I found most noteworthy is that in the very first sphere of paradise, the very first sphere, the author, Dante, remember, Dante is actually not only the character in the comedy, but Dante is writing this. And what the author does, Dante, is he devotes 1.5 full cantos, a very long dialogue. He devotes 1.5 full cantos to a dialogue between himself and Beatrice on the subject of the freedom of the will, free will. And again, here, his use of language is extraordinary, because in the course of this dialogue, he uses a whole series of words to examine various shadings of the meaning of will. And I'm not going to try to discuss these various words with you, but I am going to tell you what some of them are. So he uses a series of words, including volanta, volia, voler, envolia, volantade. Now, as you can see, all of these words have a certain resemblance to the English word voluntary. And Dante explores the various, shadings of the meanings of these words in the course of this long dialogue with Beatrice. And the subject of the dialogue is the direction of one's, the willful direction of human love toward divine ends, right? And that this is the natural condition of paradise. And Dante says in this dialogue, the greatest gift that God in his largesse gave to creation, the most attuned to his goodness, and that he accounts the most dear, was the freedom of the will. All creatures possessed of intellect, all of them, and they alone, were and are so endowed. And some people might disagree with this, but in my mind, the entirety of the paradise is an examination of willful self-perfection. And if you follow the journey that Dante is on, it really begins in the purgatory, but it is much different once he enters paradise. It's ever ascending, ever rising, always upward, being drawn closer and closer, to what he calls the prime mover of all things universal, being drawn towards that, such that one's will is in attune with that. As they ascend upward, they move through a lot of these circles of paradise, which I'm not going to go through. But finally, in Canto 10, Dante says, he sort of presents a challenge in his own way, a challenge to the reader. And he says, stay on your bench now, reader, thinking of the joy you have but tasted. if well before, let me read that again. Stay on your bench now, reader, thinking of the joy you have but tasted. If well before you tire, you would be happy. I have set your table. From here on, feed yourself. So he's talking directly to you, to the reader. I have set your table. From here on, feed yourself. For my attention now resides in that matter of which I have become the scribe. It is Beatrice who leads from good to better so suddenly that her action has no measurement in time. Whatever I saw within the sun, how shining it must have been, for when I entered, it revealed itself not by color, but by light. Were I to call on genius, skill, and practice, I could not ever tell how this might be imagined, enough if one believes and longs to see it. And if the powers of our imagination are too earthbound for such height, it is no wonder, for eye has never seen light brighter than the sun. And then in Canto 14, Dante makes it very clear where the motive for such willful improvement derives. He says, just as long as the festival of paradise shall last, that is how long our love shall dress us in this radiance. Its brightness answers to our ardor, the ardor to our vision, and that is given in greater measure of grace than we deserve, so that the light granted us freely by the highest good shall increase the light that makes us fit to see him. From that light, vision must increase, and love increase what vision kindles, and radiance increase, which comes from love. In Canto 22, they enter the fixed stars. And even though this sort of breaks the topic here, I do want to mention this, that in this, realm of the fixed stars, and this is, very high up in the Paradiso, in Canto 29, Dante delivers the author Dante, through the mouth of the character, delivers his most withering attack on the financial corruption, bribery, and other financial crimes that are being committed by the upper echelons of the Catholic Church. Now, as they enter the realm of the after the fixed stars, they enter the realm of the primum mobile, which is right below the highest level. And as they enter that, Beatrice says, the nature of the universe, which holds the center still and moves all else about it, starts here as from its boundary line. This heaven has no other where but in the mind of God, in which is kindled the love that turns it and the power it pours down. Light and love enclose it in a circle as it contains the others. Of that girding, he that girds it is the sole intelligence. Its motion is not measured by an others, but from it all the rest receive their measures, even as does 10 from its half and from its fifth. How time should have its roots in a single flower pot and its foliage in all the others may now become quite clear to you. As they are leaving the primum mobile, Beatrice says, Dante introduces comments by Beatrice. With the voice and bearing of a god who has discharged his duty, she began. We have issued from the largest body of heaven, we have issued from the largest body to the heaven of pure light, light intellectual, full of love, love of true good, full of joy, joy that surpasses every sweetness. Here you shall see both soldieries of paradise, one of them in such form as you shall see it at the final judgment. Like sudden lightning that confounds the faculty of light, depriving eyes of taking in the clearest objects, thus did a living light shine all around me, leaving me so swathed in the veil of effulgence that I saw nothing else. And then from there, they enter the Imperium, where Dante enters the presence of God. And I'm not going to read that to you. I really believe that everyone has to make that journey for themselves. So that is really what I wanted to say. There's a lot more I could say. And people might ask, well, the title of this is The Relevance of Dante to the, why is Dante, I don't know, crucial for the MAGA movement today? And some people might be scratching their heads after this presentation, but you could go back and reflect on what I read to you from Lyndon LaRouche. We have a lot of people who are governed by rage, by bestial emotions, and some of them are our enemies. We know who they are, but also many of our friends and allies. Next week we're going to go into the creation of the Renaissance, and this, the creation of the Renaissance did not come about through rage, through just denouncing evil, through these kind of things. We'll explore this more next week. But what Dante is presenting here is not just a story about purgatory, inferno, purgatory, and paradise. He is presenting this question of what it means to be truly human. I mean, if you want to put it in a certain kind of way, to be made in the image of God. He's presenting this question of the will, one's will being driven by and being in absolute congruence with agape, with love. I could tell you, if nothing else, I urge you all to read it. It is, in my view, without question, without anything else even coming close, the greatest piece of literature ever written. So that's what I'm going to say here tonight, folks. I hope people got something out of it.